Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, October 1887. When three bandits cornered 19-year-old Rose Valencia behind the Copper Bell Saloon's bar, salvation came from an unlikely source. Jake Morgan, a bounty hunter who'd come for different prey entirely. He left three men bleeding in the sawdust and vanished without asking for thanks. 7 years later, Rose would find him dying in the Sonoran Desert, bullets in his back and buzzards circling overhead. What began with violence would end with mercy, proving that sometimes the most broken souls save each other, not seeking redemption, but recognizing something worth saving when the world has given up. Chapter 1. Blood and Silver. The Copper Bell Saloon reeked of whiskey, sweat, and gun oil on that October night in 1887. Silver Creek sat like a festering wound on the Arizona Territory's hide, drawing every manner of desperate soul seeking fortune in the silver mines or escape from whatever law still reached this far into the desert. Rose Valencia had learned to navigate these dangers for 3 years, serving drinks and deflecting advances with practiced efficiency, but tonight felt different from the moment the last honest patron stumbled into the darkness. 3 men remained when she began wiping down the bar. Colton Hayes and 2 riders whose names she never learned but whose eyes promised violence. The proprietor had departed an hour earlier, leaving Rose to close alone as punishment for refusing his latest advance. She kept her movements steady, avoiding eye contact while calculating the distance to the back door. Hayes moved first, his boots heavy on the warped floorboards. The other 2 flanked her, cutting off escape routes with the practiced coordination of men who'd done this before. Rose's fingers found the bottle she kept beneath the bar, not for drinking, but for moments like these. The glass felt cold against her palm, a poor weapon against 3 armed men, but better than surrender. They spoke of what they intended with casual cruelty, their words slurring together like spilled liquor. Hayes reached across the bar, his fingers brushing her wrist before she jerked away. The movement triggered something primal in them, transforming leering interest into predatory intent. One grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around while another laughed, a sound like grinding metal that would haunt her dreams for years. The saloon doors didn't swing open so much as explode inward. Jake Morgan stood silhouetted against the night, dust still settling around his long coat. 6 feet of weathered violence wrapped in leather and trail dirt. He surveyed the scene with eyes that had witnessed too much to be surprised by anything. The bounty hunter's reputation preceded him. 23 confirmed captures, most brought in across their saddles rather than sitting upright. Hayes recognized him first, hand moving toward his pistol before freezing halfway. Morgan hadn't come for them. That much was clear from his initial indifference. He'd been tracking someone else, probably sleeping off whiskey in one of the rooms upstairs. But something in Rose's face, pressed against the bar with tears cutting channels through rouge, shifted his attention. The violence that followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but would stretch into eternity in Rose's memory. Morgan moved with economical precision, no wasted motion or dramatic flourishes. His Colt Peacemaker cleared leather faster than he thought. The first shot took Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him into a table that collapsed under his weight. The second man reached for his gun and received a bullet through his hand for the effort, his scream sharp enough to shatter glass. The third tried to use Rose as a shield, but Morgan's boot connected with his knee, dropping him before the gun barrel pressed against his temple ended all resistance. Morgan holstered his weapon and turned toward the stairs, apparently finished with the interruption. He'd saved her life as casually as stepping around a puddle, without expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement. Rose stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the transition from victim to survivor. Finding her voice, she called after him, asking why he'd intervened. Morgan paused on the 3rd step, considering. His answer came quietly but clear. He'd seen enough women buried in unmarked graves along the frontier, and tonight he could prevent one more. Then he continued upstairs, spurs ringing against wood, leaving Rose standing among 3 groaning men and the shattered remains of her former life. She gathered her few possessions that night and disappeared into the desert, carrying the memory of unexpected mercy from a man who dealt primarily in death. Chapter 2. Desert Reckoning. 7 years transformed everything except memory. By spring of 1894, Rose Valencia had built herself into something respectable, a seamstress with steady hands and a small adobe house 12 miles outside Tucson. The desert had taught her solitude wasn't the same as loneliness, that survival meant more than drawing breath, and that some debts could never be forgotten even when the creditor vanished like smoke. She found him on a Tuesday morning when the sun barely touched the mountains. Her weekly supply run to Tucson required crossing a stretch of Sonoran Desert that most travelers avoided. Too many bones bleached white among the saguaro cacti. Too many stories of men who entered but never emerged. Rose knew these trails because isolation had become her shield against a world that consumed careless women without apology. The buzzards led her to him. 3 black shapes circling lower with each pass, their shadows crossing the sand like portents. Rose might have continued past. The desert claimed its share of fools and desperados daily. But something in the way the body lay, face down with arms stretched toward shade that remained forever out of reach, made her pull the wagon to a stop. Even before she turned him over, she knew. Perhaps it was the long coat, now torn and caked with blood, or the way his fingers still curved as if holding an invisible gun. Jake Morgan's face had weathered 7 more years of violence, new scars crossing old ones like a map of brutal encounters, but those eyes remained unmistakable even while closed against the killing sun. 3 bullet wounds decorated his back, one near the shoulder blade, another through his ribs, the third dangerously close to his spine. The blood had dried to rusty brown, but fresh red seeped through when she pressed her fingers against his neck, searching for life. His pulse came weak but stubborn, like the man himself refusing to surrender even when logic demanded otherwise. Rose faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The practical response would be leaving him in the desert to finish claiming. Men who earned bullets in their backs rarely brought anything but trouble to those who helped them. She'd built her quiet life carefully, each stitch and seam creating distance from the saloon girl who'd once served whiskey to minors and worse. Jake Morgan represented everything she'd escaped: violence, desperation, the thin line between law and lawlessness that defined frontier justice. Instead, she dragged him to her wagon. His weight nearly defeated her, 200 pounds of dying bounty hunter who groaned but didn't wake as she wrestled him onto the boards. Blood soaked through her dress, mixing with sweat and determination while she covered him with canvas and turned toward home, pushing the horses harder than wisdom suggested. The next 3 days blurred into a fever dream of their own. Rose extracted 2 bullets with tools meant for different purposes. Seamstress scissors sterilized in flame, thread meant for silk garments closing wounds that wanted to keep bleeding. The 3rd bullet sat too deep, pressed against something vital that would kill him if disturbed. She packed it with desert herbs her Mexican neighbor had taught her, remedies older than territorial borders. Jake's fever spiked the second night, transforming him into something wild. He thrashed against invisible enemies, calling out names of dead men and dying towns. Sometimes he spoke to his mother, apologizing for becoming what she'd feared. Other times, he recited numbers, bounty prices, kill counts, the arithmetic of a life measured in violence. Rose held him down, forced water between cracked lips, and sang the only lullaby she remembered from childhood, while his body fought to decide between living and dying. On the 3rd dawn, his eyes opened clear. Recognition came slowly, confusion giving way to something like wonder as he processed Rose's face above him. Older now, but unmistakable. She watched him remember. First who she was, then what he'd done 7 years ago. Finally, the impossibility of her being here now, when he'd clearly come to this desert to die. His first word came out as a rasp, barely audible, but carrying the weight of genuine bewilderment. He asked if heaven looked like a seamstress's cottage, or if the devil had developed an ironic sense of humor. Rose's answer came simple and direct. He wasn't dead yet, though not for lack of trying, and she'd appreciate it if he'd stopped bleeding on her only good quilt. Chapter 3. debts, and devotion. Recovery came measured in small victories, sitting upright without the room spinning, holding a spoon steady enough to eat, walking 3 steps before collapsing back onto the narrow bed. Jake Morgan proved a difficult patient, not from complaint, but from stubborn attempts at leaving before his body could support the decision. Rose found him twice, trying to saddle her old mare with hands that shook too violently to manage the buckles, and once collapsed in her doorway with his Colt strapped on, though the weapon's weight nearly pulled him sideways. The truth emerged in pieces during those long desert evenings. Jake had been tracking the Garrison brothers for 6 months when they'd turned the hunt around, ambushing him near Skeleton Canyon. The price on his head had grown larger than most of the bounties he'd collected, $1,500, enough to make even honest men consider collection. 20 years of bringing in criminals had created a peculiar problem. Too many enemies among the living and not enough friends to notice him missing. Rose learned his history while changing bandages and forcing him to drink her bitter medicinal tea. Born in Missouri to a schoolteacher who died disappointed in her son's choices. Fought in too many range wars to remember them all clearly. Killed his first man at 17, defending a ranch that wasn't even his. The law had been a convenient excuse for violence until the excuse stopped mattering and only the violence remained. She shared her own transformation in return, speaking of nights spent learning to read by candlelight using dress patterns as textbooks. The widow who taught her proper stitching had seen potential beyond pouring whiskey, investing months teaching Rose a trade that required precision instead of tolerance. Every dress she made, every hem perfectly straight, stood as proof that people could change if given reason enough to try. Jake watched her work in the evenings, fingers moving with surgical precision while she created beautiful things from raw cloth. Sometimes she caught him staring with an expression that bordered on reverence, as if witnessing magic instead of simple craftsmanship. He told her once that he'd spent so many years taking life apart that watching someone put things together felt like learning a foreign language he'd never known existed. The moment arrived without fanfare on a Thursday evening. Jake had managed to walk to the porch, where he sat watching the sun paint the desert gold and crimson. Rose brought coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she usually served, and settled beside him on the bench she'd built herself the previous winter. The silence stretched comfortably between them, filled with cricket songs and distant coyote calls. He spoke first, voice rough from disuse, and something deeper than injury. The words came haltingly, like he was pulling them from some deep place that hadn't seen light in decades. He'd been ready to die in that desert, had chosen that particular stretch because it felt fitting, empty, forgotten, unlikely to burden anyone with his corpse. Finding himself alive felt like cheating at cards, except he couldn't figure out who he'd cheated or whether winning meant anything anymore. Rose set down her coffee with deliberate care before responding. She told him about the nightmares that followed Silver Creek, how she'd wake certain that those 3 men had succeeded, that his intervention had been the dream instead of their assault. For 7 years, she'd carried the weight of a life, saved without knowing why it had been saved, until finding him had provided an answer she hadn't known she'd been seeking. Debts, she explained, ran both directions. He'd given her the chance to become something more than victim or survivor, and now she was returning that possibility. The kiss happened because words became insufficient. Not passionate or desperate, but careful, like 2 people handling something fragile that might shatter if grasped too tightly. Jake's hand trembled against her cheek, whether from weakness or emotion, she couldn't determine. When they pulled apart, his eyes held something she'd never seen in them before. Not the cold calculation of a hunter or the fever-bright delirium of the dying, but simple, unguarded hope. That night, Jake stopped trying to leave. Rose found him the next morning, cleaning his guns with steady hands, but when she asked if he was preparing to ride out, he simply shook his head. Some hunts, he said, were worth abandoning, especially when what you found mattered more than what you'd been chasing. Chapter 4. The Last Hunt. They came at dawn 3 weeks later, for riders moving through the morning mist like prophecy fulfilled. Rose saw them first from her window, their silhouettes wrong against the familiar landscape, too rigid, too purposeful, carrying themselves with the particular arrogance of men who killed for profit. She recognized the Garrison brothers from Jake's fevered descriptions, plus two others whose presence meant the bounty had drawn professional attention. Jake stood from the bed with fluid grace, his recovery suddenly complete in the face of necessity. The transformation struck Rose as remarkable, from wounded invalid to lethal professional in the space between heartbeats. He checked his Colt's cylinder with practiced efficiency while calculating angles and possibilities with eyes that had returned to their original coldness. The tactical situation offered little hope. 4 men against 1 wounded gunfighter and a seamstress seemed like arithmetic with only one solution. Jake suggested she hide in the root cellar, wait for the violence to pass, then continue her life as if he'd never existed. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man reconciled to his fate, already writing himself out of her future with clinical detachment. Rose's response surprised them both. She retrieved her father's old Spencer rifle from above the doorframe, checking its action with movements Jake had taught her during his recovery. 7 shots against 4 men might seem like favorable math if you didn't factor in experience, but Rose had learned that determination could sometimes balance inexperience. She'd survived too much to surrender her new life without resistance. The Garrison brothers split their approach, with 2 circling toward the back while 2 advanced from the front. Classical tactics that had probably worked dozens of times against men who thought courage meant facing danger head-on. Jake positioned himself near the front window while Rose took the back door, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Violence arrived with the morning sun. The younger Garrison kicked through the front door, expecting to find Jake cowering or fleeing. Instead, he met 2 bullets that dropped him before his boots touched Rose's clean floor. His brother screamed rage from outside, firing through windows with abandon while glass showered the room like deadly rain. Rose's moment came when one rider tried the back entrance. She fired through the door itself, with splintering outward as the heavy Spencer round found its mark. The man's surprised grunt preceded his collapse, the sound of his body hitting her porch boards strangely final. Her second shot took the other rear attacker in the thigh as he tried to reach cover, sending him crawling toward his horse with curses that would have made her blush in another life. The last Garrison brother made his fatal error, attempting to flank through Rose's bedroom window. Jake had anticipated this, waiting with patience learned from 20 years of similar confrontations. The exchange lasted seconds, 2 shots almost simultaneous, powder smoke filling the small room, while both men measured each other's resolve through iron sights. Garrison's bullet creased Jake's shoulder. Jake's bullet found center mass, ending the discussion permanently. Silence settled like dust after a storm. The wounded rider had escaped, carrying news that would either bring more hunters or spread word that Jake Morgan had become too expensive to collect. Jake stood among the carnage, blood seeping through his shirt, while he looked at Rose with something approaching awe. She'd fought beside him without hesitation, transforming from seamstress to warrior when survival demanded adaptation. They left that afternoon, loading the wagon with only essentials and heading toward California's promise of anonymity. The house stood empty behind them, her carefully built life abandoned for an uncertain future that somehow felt more honest than the isolation she'd previously accepted. Years later, travelers would find the cabin converted to a way station, run by a quiet couple whose occasional guests noted the woman's beautiful needlework and the man's unusual knowledge of territorial law. Their 3 children grew up believing their father had been a lawman and their mother a schoolteacher, never questioning why both parents proved uncommonly skilled with firearms or why certain dangerous men occasionally arrived seeking shelter, but never trouble. If this story of redemption and second chances in the Old West touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next Frontier Tale. Let me know in the comments which moment moved you most. Was it when Rose found Jake dying in the desert, or when they fought side by side against his past? Your support means everything to this channel. Thanks for listening to another tale from the American frontier, and I'll see you in the next story.